That night started like any other in this house. I'm Riley, an interior designer, looking over a few unfinished sketches on the dining table. I usually work there because the kitchen light is bright enough and the space feels calm. Kyle, my husband, a mechanical engineer, was in the living room reviewing project files he said were the biggest headache of the month. No one raised their voice, no sign of tension, just the sound of papers moving and my pen tapping lightly on the edge of the table. Kyle stood up and walked toward me to grab a water bottle. He passed behind my shoulder, paused for half a second, and then suddenly swung his hand. I didn't have time to react. The pain was real, but what froze me wasn't the hit. It was the feeling that my body split away from me, like I was watching it from the corner of the room instead of living it from inside my own face. Kyle froze. I could see the flash of regret in his eyes. Then it was immediately replaced by the same excuses he always used. Pressure from the project, clients changing the plans, his boss pushing deadlines, the wine from dinner making him lose control. I heard every word, but my head felt wrapped in thick cotton. I didn't ask anything. I didn't say, "Don't do that." I just kept my breathing steady, my right hand resting on the table like I needed it to stay balanced. He reached for my shoulder, trying to apologize. I stepped back half a step. Not much, but enough for him to understand. I didn't want him close. In that moment, I saw something clearly. Kyle wasn't sorry for hurting me. He was sorry he didn't know what I would do next. I went upstairs and closed the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't want it to seem like I was building a wall. I just needed silence for a moment so I could sort through what had just happened. As a designer, I'm used to defining lines, what goes where, which corner makes sense, which light fits. But what happened didn't have a place. It just sat there, blocking the path forward, refusing to shift to the side so I could breathe. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, knowing something in this marriage had cracked, and I wasn't sure it could be put back together. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I went downstairs, grabbed eggs and butter from the fridge. The motions were so familiar, I didn't have to think about them. I always cook in the morning, partly because I like the smell of butter melting in the pan, partly because it helps settle my mind before work. Today, everything looked the same, except the air felt different. When Kyle came down, I heard his footsteps slow. I knew he was looking at the left side of my face, where the bruise was still a little red. I didn't turn around. I flipped the eggs, set them on a plate, then added a few slices of toast like I do every day. No act, no pretending to be calm. I just did what I normally do. He sat down and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked if I slept well. I nodded. I didn't look at him. He asked if my face still hurt. I answered with one word less. Kyle isn't used to short answers. He's used to me explaining, softening things, smoothing everything over. Today my voice stayed flat. He said he was sorry. I said, "I heard you. That's it." Nothing more. The way I spoke wasn't cold. It just lacked the softness I usually add to every conversation so Kyle won't feel pushed back. He noticed that missing layer right away. It was like the room had less air, and he was the only one who felt it. While we ate, Kyle kept glancing up at me, like he was trying to read my face to gauge where things stood. I didn't help him. I wasn't angry. I wasn't ignoring him. I just moved through that morning at my own pace. That unsettled him more than any argument could. When he stood up to leave for work, he leaned forward a little, ready to place a hand on my back like he always did, then pulled away. I looked at him for 1 second and said, "I'm staying home today." I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Kyle looked at me longer than usual, like he wanted to ask something but didn't want to hear the answer. He just nodded, slow and awkward, something I rarely saw in him. The door closed behind him, and the house settled back into its usual quiet. But this time I knew that quiet didn't belong to me. It weighed on him, not me. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and realized my silence had turned into a new language, one Kyle didn't understand, couldn't control, and didn't know how to respond to. He was always strongest when I softened. But that morning, I wasn't soft. I wasn't hard either. I just stood upright and let the space between us do its job. That was the first moment I saw it clearly. Kyle was starting to be afraid. Not afraid of me. Afraid of what he couldn't read in me. And that's when everything for him began to fall apart in ways he never saw coming. When the door closed behind Kyle that morning, I stayed still for a moment. Not to calm myself. I just wanted to feel the shift that had happened between us. That silence didn't come from the night before. It had formed long before that. And to understand why I could stand calmly in the kitchen that morning, I had to look back at our early years, the time when everything seemed good but had already tilted just enough to lead to last night. 3-4 years ago, I met Kyle while overseeing a small office renovation. He came in to check the technical systems. Kyle was sharp, knew what he was talking about, and carried a kind of confidence that made people assume he was safe. I had just switched companies at the time and was still trying to find my place in a new design team. He watched me work, asked a few small questions, then suddenly invited me out for a drink to unwind. The way he said it sounded like someone used to taking responsibility, and I've always been drawn to people like that. Steady, clear, and sure of where they're going. In the beginning, Kyle was thoughtful in a very intentional way, opening the car door, carrying heavy drawing sets for me, noticing every small detail. But along with that thoughtfulness were little comments I didn't pay attention to back then. Like the time I mentioned a male coworker I was close to. Kyle smiled and said, "I just don't want anyone to get the wrong idea about you." I thought it was a caring line. Looking back, it was almost a soft warning. A few months into dating, Kyle started asking who I was with and where I was going. Not harshly, just so I can feel at ease. I've always been scared of disappointing people, so I took it as a sign that I mattered to him. I didn't see that it was the first step toward control. I remember one night I planned to meet my college friends. Kyle said he was tired and wanted me to stay home and watch a movie with him. I said no, that I already had plans. He didn't argue, he just looked at me a few seconds longer than usual and said, "Men don't like women who keep talking back." I laughed it off, thinking it was a conservative joke. It wasn't a joke. I just didn't understand that at the time. In the months after that, Kyle had a few moments of anger that came out of nowhere. One time he slammed a stack of files on the table when a client changed their requirements. His voice was loud but not aimed at me, and right after he apologized, hugged me, and said he was just stressed. I believed him. I even thought I could be the person who helped him stay balanced. That's one of my biggest weaknesses. I thought if I was gentle enough, patient enough, the other person would calm down, but really, I just made it easier for him to cross the line. There was an afternoon in the grocery store parking lot. I had just chatted with a male coworker I bumped into by chance. The conversation lasted a few minutes. When I got back to the car, Kyle grabbed my wrist so hard it startled me. His face tightened, his eyes a little red. He said, "I didn't like that. That's all, no yelling, no throwing things." But his grip was strong enough to make me drop my shopping bag. He let go right after and apologized. I made excuses for him, thinking he was just jealous. Now when I think back, that was the first time my body reacted with fear I pushed down and tried to soothe away. And the time he yelled in my face after losing a contract. I was in the kitchen making a glass of water when he came running downstairs, threw the design plans on the table, and said it was all my fault for making him lose focus. I just stood there, stunned. Not even a minute later, he broke down crying and said he was under too much pressure. I held him, feeling more pity than anger. That was the moment I understood why it was so hard for me to leave him. I always saw Kyle's fragile side, and I always thought it was the part I was supposed to fix. I forgave every one of those moments, and with each forgiveness, I brushed another thin layer over the cracks that were growing. I'm not someone who likes confrontation. I'm scared of disappointing people. I'm scared of being the difficult woman. I thought if I spoke softer, kinder, everything would calm down. I was wrong. Looking back, there were so many small warnings I ignored. A look that was too sharp when I laughed with someone else. A sentence that sounded like a command but came wrapped in a gentle tone. A grip on my hand that was a little too tight, followed by an immediate apology. Each thing on its own wasn't enough to make me run, but when you line them up over time, they form the exact shape I saw clearly that night. Last night wasn't the first time Kyle crossed a line. It was just the first time he didn't bother covering it with an apology. And that moment, his hand coming down for no reason, made every excuse I'd ever made for him collapse at once. When I stood in the kitchen this morning, calmly making eggs, I knew I'd stepped out of the illusion I'd held on to all these years. Not an illusion about love. An illusion that if I stayed soft enough, tried hard enough, tolerated enough, I could hold together a man with problems he had no intention of fixing himself. That night didn't just hurt me. It broke the way I saw him, and the way I saw myself in this marriage. And because that illusion finally cracked, I could be silent in a way Kyle couldn't make sense of. That silence wasn't a weapon I chose. It was what remained after every hope I ever had for him had fallen away. After that morning, when Kyle left the house with that confused look he tried to hide, I cleaned the kitchen and sat at the dining table, the same spot I always use when I need to work. But today I didn't open my laptop. I just rested my hands on the table and let the quiet spread. Because from the moment Kyle looked at me before walking out the door, I knew the balance between us had shifted. Not because I had become stronger, but because he had started to fear what he couldn't predict. At noon, Kyle texted asking if I had eaten. I replied, yes. He asked what I wanted for dinner. I wrote back, anything. No exclamation mark, no emoji, no forced coldness, just simplicity. Silence with a clear shape but no malice. Kyle picked up on that. I knew because 2 minutes later he sent 3 more messages. Asking how I felt, whether I needed him to come home early, whether I was angry at him. I answered with one word, no. When Kyle came home that night, he tried to make things feel warm. He brought my favorite food, turned on the soft yellow kitchen lights. The kind I once said helped me relax after long work days. But I just thanked him briefly. I ate slowly, not avoiding his eyes, but not seeking them either. It wasn't the silence of someone picking a fight. It was the silence of someone who didn't want to spend extra energy. And that scared Kyle more. He asked me 3 times in 10 minutes what last night made you think about. I only answered, nothing. Kyle didn't believe that. I could see it in the way he clenched his hands under the table, like he was trying to calm a child screaming inside his head. Someone who's used to expressing emotion by controlling others can't handle it when they can't read the person in front of them. And Kyle had always been used to that. In the days that followed, I talked less. Not as punishment, just because I didn't want to add layers of words to keep him stable anymore. I answered with yeah, okay, up to you when he asked small things. And the more I did that, the more Kyle asked. His questions came fast, trying to pull reactions out of me, like he was checking the heartbeat of someone who had just come out of shock. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just kept my responses at the smallest possible pace. That made Kyle think I was hiding something. He was scared I'd tell my friends. Scared I'd pack my things while he slept. Scared I knew something about him that he didn't want to admit out loud. I didn't have to threaten to leave. The idea showed up in his mind on its own. When a man who's used to being in control suddenly loses the ability to read the person in front of him, his fear doesn't come from what you do. It comes from what he imagines you're thinking. Kyle got stuck in those thoughts. I just stayed still and let him spin inside them. On Tuesday night, he cleaned the kitchen for me, even though he rarely did. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said I wanted to sleep early. He said he understood, but I could see the disappointment and fear tightening behind his eyes. It was something I'd never seen before. Kyle wasn't used to being the one left behind. On the 5th day, I heard him talking on the phone in his office. His voice was low but tense. He told someone that things at home are a bit messy and that he needs a few days to settle. I knew he was talking about me, but I didn't go in. I just walked past the door. When he saw me, he stopped talking immediately, like someone caught doing something they shouldn't. At his company, the lack of sleep started showing faster than I expected. One of Kyle's coworkers texted me, someone I'd met once at one of his work events, asking if Kyle was okay because he looks a little off. I just said I wasn't sure. The truth was, I knew better than anyone, but the truth wasn't my responsibility anymore. A day later, Kyle slipped up in front of his boss. He rambled about being unfocused and blamed the pressure. The same coworker told me Kyle talked too much, too fast, and spilled some personal things he normally kept hidden. People noticed the instability. Kyle didn't. He only understood that people were watching him, and again assumed I had told someone something. That night, Kyle came home late, face heavy, eyes red like someone who hadn't slept. He said his coworkers were acting differently toward him. I asked, why? He looked away and said he didn't know. I didn't say anything else. I wanted the silence to speak for me. Kyle hated that silence. He'd rather be confronted than listen to his own thoughts. His panic started twisting into opposite reactions. One night he brought flowers, cooked dinner, set the table like he was making amends. The next day he snapped because I didn't laugh at a story he told about work. Everything swung back and forth within days, from over-the-top gentle to pointlessly irritable. That shift didn't come from him trying to be better. It came from him no longer knowing where his safe ground was. I just watched. I didn't add comments. I didn't bring up that night. I didn't talk about the future. I let each of his actions shine a light on the parts of him I had been shielding for years. Not to get revenge, but so I could finally see what I'd been living next to. For almost 2 weeks, Kyle didn't touch me. Not out of respect, not because I asked. He was scared. Scared that one wrong touch might turn into evidence against him, even though I never threatened anything like that. He was afraid even when I was silent. And when a man starts fearing the silence of his own wife, the power balance has already shifted completely. Kyle didn't hit me again, not because he suddenly became kind, but because, to him, I was no longer someone he could unload on. I became something he couldn't read, couldn't hold, couldn't predict. And that fear, not anything I did, was what slowly ate at him, piece by piece. After almost 2 weeks of Kyle living in a half-scared, half-pretending to be normal state, I started to see a clear change in him. Not a good change. A loss of control. The silence I left for him to fill had started doing what fear always does. It stretched, it grew, it magnified. Kyle wanted certainty about what was happening in my head. And that need pushed him into behaviors he used to know how to hide. On Monday morning, while I was making a drink, Kyle stood behind me longer than usual. He didn't say anything, but I heard him flip my phone over, checking the screen like he hoped it would show a secret on its own. I didn't pull it back. I let him do it. When he tried to unlock it with my fingerprint and failed, he looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I just said, "My phone's the same as always." Neutral voice, no accusation, no softness. That night, he opened my laptop while I was showering. When I walked out, he turned the screen toward me like he'd caught something. The page open was a half-finished design file. He asked what I was hiding. I looked at him for a single second, not angry, not tired, just looking. A look that didn't confirm or deny anything. The kind of look that makes the other person fill in the blank with whatever they fear most. I wasn't trying to set a trap, but to Kyle, it felt like the perfect psychological bait. From there, he went downhill fast. At work, Kyle argued with his department head over a small change in the project plan. I heard about it from a coworker who texted me because Kyle seems a little off. The next day, he sent out an important technical design with mistakes in it. That wasn't like him. Kyle always prided himself on being meticulous. But when you're not sleeping and constantly afraid someone is seeing through you, carefulness is the first thing to disappear. And it didn't stop there. He snapped at a client during a meeting, all because the client asked for one more detail, and Kyle took it as a direct challenge. I heard the story from a friend who works at his company. He reacted like he was being attacked. No one understood the cause. They just saw that Kyle was different. Tense, fragile, suspicious. As his work life started unraveling, his friends began reaching out to me. One of Kyle's closest friends called me at night. "Riley, are you okay? Kyle's been talking weird these days." I just said, "I'm fine." That answer quietly pointed everyone's attention toward Kyle. Not me. But I didn't do it on purpose. I was simply telling the truth. I was steadier than he thought. Then Kyle started defending himself when talking to his friends. He talked about work pressure, about me being distant, about how he felt judged. But while explaining, he slipped out details he should have kept buried. Like, "Riley's been acting strange since that night." One of his friends asked, "What night?" Kyle dodged the question, but it was enough. The pieces started making people look at him more closely. When the company called him into a meeting and asked him to take a few days off to get stable, Kyle almost completely lost his footing. He came home early that day, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled. He said the company wanted him to take leave because people are misunderstanding me. I only asked, "What are you gonna do next?" Kyle didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, like whatever he said depended on my reaction, which I kept exactly neutral. That night, for the first time in days, Kyle sat down in front of me and said he wanted to have a serious talk. I nodded. He started telling me he felt insecure, afraid of losing me, afraid I had the wrong idea, afraid I would tell someone about that night. He talked fast, repeated himself, even stopped mid-sentence at times like he didn't know what he was about to confess. I listened. No reaction, no judgment. I just kept my posture straight and my eyes neutral. the kind of look that turns into a mirror and forces someone to face themselves. Kyle slammed the table, stood up, asked why I wasn't saying anything, why I wouldn't explain. I just answered, I don't have anything to say. No anger, no bitterness, just the truth. That truth drove him crazy in a way silence can unsteady someone more than shouting ever could. Kyle was used to steering the conversation, used to getting some kind of response from me, so he knew which direction to take. But now, every time he tried to push the conversation one way, my stillness pushed him back toward the fear he'd been hiding all along. The fear of losing control. One night, Kyle asked if I planned to leave him. I looked at him for a moment and said, I haven't thought about that yet. It wasn't reassurance, it wasn't a threat, it was simply the truth. And that truth, undefined, unmapped, made him lose his footing even more. In the days after, Kyle paced the house more. He reread old messages between us, like he was searching for proof that I was still the Riley he knew. He went through my phone again, this time more hesitant, almost asking for permission without saying the words. I let him look if he wanted. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I could see clearly that every move he made wasn't the action of someone in control, but of someone trying to hold on to something he had broken himself. Slowly, I watched his career crack along the same fault line that night had opened. Not because of the hit, but because of the silence after. The silence that made him dig into the dark corners he'd always kept hidden. That weekend, Kyle sat on the couch, eyes on the floor, shoulders collapsed like someone pushed to a dead end. He didn't say it, but I knew he understood what he'd spent years refusing to admit. He had struck a person he could no longer read. And that, not me, was what was sending his career, his life, and his sense of self downhill with no breaks. In the days after Kyle was told to take time off, the house was filled with a kind of heaviness we'd never had before. The muted desperation of a man who no longer knew what to hold on to. One night he called his mother. I heard his voice from the other room. He spoke quietly, but I heard enough to know he couldn't keep up the strong image in front of his family anymore. He admitted he messed up, that I wasn't the same, that he was afraid she'll leave. He didn't mention hitting me, but he let enough slip for his mother to understand this wasn't a small issue. Every word he said stained his own image without anyone having to judge him. With his best friend, it was the same. I accidentally overheard part of a call where Kyle tried to explain that everything is a misunderstanding, then a moment later admitted, but I think I went too far that time. The contradiction in his words didn't come from me. It came from the fact that he no longer knew the line between what he wanted to believe and what he was afraid might be true. The funny thing is, through all of his panic, I hadn't done anything that looked like someone preparing to leave. I didn't hide documents. I didn't gather evidence. I didn't record anything. I didn't do a single thing Kyle imagined I was doing. But that only made him more scared. Kyle's biggest fear wasn't that I'd leave him. It was that I was silent enough that he couldn't tell what I was holding. Kyle started losing sleep for real. At night, he'd go downstairs for water 3-4 times. I heard his heavy steps on each stair, nothing like the confident stride he used to have. He neglected work, didn't answer emails, didn't even read the reports the company sent him. And then one afternoon, he received an official warning for not completing his tasks. Kyle opened that email right in front of me. I saw his hand shake, but I didn't say anything. That night was the breaking point. Kyle walked into the living room where I was sitting, no longer trying to look strong. He sat in front of me, shoulders fully collapsed. For the first time in a long while, he didn't demand that I explain anything. He just said, "Riley, I don't know what to do anymore. I'm begging you to talk to me." I looked at him. No argument, no accusation, no questioning. I just said one sentence, steady and calm, "I'm not safe here." I saw that sentence cut straight through him. Not because it was loud, but because it was the truth he'd been trying not to face. Kyle didn't say anything back. He just stared at me, eyes hollow, like he'd just watched part of his life collapse and no longer had the strength to hold it up. I stood up, went to the bedroom, and took out a small suitcase. I didn't pack much. Just a few clothes, my notebook, my laptop, my documents. I put each item in calmly, not rushing like someone running away, not lingering like someone being left behind. When I walked back into the living room, Kyle was still there on the sofa, hands clasped, head low. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask if I'd come back. He just breathed heavily, as if every word had lost its meaning. I walked past him and set the house key on the table. Kyle didn't look up. I opened the door. There was no call from behind me. I knew he heard it, but he didn't stand. And maybe that was the first moment I truly saw his collapse. Not because he was losing me, but because everything he'd spent years hiding had finally come out in front of himself. When I walked out of that house, I felt a strange lightness. Not because I escaped Kyle, but because I finally stepped out of the version of Riley who thought she had to endure everything just to keep the peace. I called my sister and told her I needed a place to stay for a few days. I also called a lawyer, not to start a fight, but to understand how to protect myself if Kyle shifted from panic to something reckless. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I thought about all the silence I'd used to hold that marriage together. I was wrong to believe silence kept things peaceful, but this time, silence saved me. Not the silence of enduring, the silence that lets you take a step back, see him clearly, and see yourself even clearer. I knew Kyle was falling apart at home, but not because he lost his wife. What terrified him most was the fact that I had seen through him when his whole life had been built on making sure no one ever did. He was afraid of being exposed, afraid of consequences, afraid of a truth he couldn't blame on anyone else. And maybe this was the first time he had to face himself without someone holding him up. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. I wasn't happy. I wasn't triumphant. I just felt whole in a way I didn't think I could again. And before I fell asleep, one sentence came to mind. A sentence I'll probably never say out loud, but it was the conclusion to everything. Have you ever stayed silent long enough to make someone else afraid? Here's what I learned from all of this. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's a boundary. It's the moment you stop and see who's truly standing with you, and who only feels strong when you stay small. When someone is too sure of their control, your calm becomes the mirror that shows them the truth they don't want to face. That's the end of the story. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you've ever been in a relationship where silence said more than explanations, would you be willing to share? And what do you think Riley should do next to rebuild her life? If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.